Good afternoon, and good morning, and good evening, everyone. Thanks for taking the time to join us today. Interestingly enough, Andrew finished on the need for education to develop digital literacy amongst people in sub-Saharan Africa. And that's interesting enough what I'm going to be talking about today. Now, in general, we look at the idea of sustainability and we say to ourselves, how does sustainability fit into education? And to start with, I look at sustainability as a course of action that accrues a benefit in the future. So let me just ask a number of questions that start to tease out where we need to be. For example, some people are saying, is technology making us less intelligent? Is technology making human beings redundant? Does sustainability apply to education? Other questions are, is education actually a responsibility of the state? And more interesting enough, especially during this COVID period, a key question is how the private education sector put technology to better use than the state or government sector of education. To answer these questions would take a lot of debate and time, but in the position I will start from is that during COVID, I believe, as a catalyst that has accelerated a number of different plans, or it exposed weaknesses in the system, in the education systems that we have around the world. So in order to move forward, one of the approaches I'm going to take is an approach where we set a generic criteria for success that allow the stakeholders of the educational system to act in a context with a reasonable assurance that the implementation plans that are developed with specific intent result in the expected impact. Now, during inspection, especially in the United Kingdom, what they try to emphasize, or what they want to see, is what were the intents of education, how do we plan to implement it, and what impact would it actually have? So pre-COVID education systems around the world operated in such a way that they put plans into place and they expected outcomes to occur. However, it's a service-driven environment. What I mean by that is that it's the service provider-driven environment, in the sense that it's the provider who decides what happens in their domain. And that is quite the contrary to most environments that we operated in. For example, normally it's the consumer that determines the services that are required, but in this case, the consumers are the learners or the parents. And often they don't actually get to say much about the services that they consume. Paid for education, for example, they pride themselves in being exclusive or being of a higher quality, but they also follow the same model. Pupils can't determine when their terms start. And those are all the shortcomings of the current education system that we have at the moment. And those are some of the questions that have raised their head as a result of COVID. If we now start to look at the impact of education, we start to ask ourselves what the resources are required to achieve the intended goals. In general, within the educational sector, there's a general feeling that educational providers are doing the best they can given the circumstances. And all the planning, implementing, and evaluation is just a cyclical activity until something unexpected like COVID comes along. Now, if we just take a look at the different stakeholders in the education system, it's been quite interesting how they've looked at and reacted to COVID. If we start with the unions, initially what the unions did is they came along and they argued that teachers are unprepared for this change. And they did their best to prevent any changes in practice in order to protect teachers and their livelihoods. Teaching staff as well were in the dark. They really just waited for the next instruction and tried to respond. Now, this is a situation where leadership now needed to act. And at the same time, the leaders in schools were unsure of what was going to happen from day to day, especially in the UK. Decisions were being taken a few days at a time. We have the Ministry of Education, or the Department of Education as it is in the UK, who basically was unable to give any guidelines to the schools or the colleges or the universities as to how to act. They left it as a health emergency and said, follow any health rules. Private educational establishments, however, they had a different imperative before them. If they did not teach the children, they would not earn their money, and therefore their survival was at risk. And they responded differently. Almost immediately, they went to online learning. But their motivating reasons was to safeguard their income. Now, this particular difference in approach is important in terms of how education should be paid for and who should be running it. And I'll come back to that later. Parents, they're also a stakeholder in this. One of the key challenges for parents is, how am I going to operate if my children are at home? A lot of parents, especially of younger children, saw educational establishments as good childcare. Employers were also in the same place, in the sense that they expected their employees to turn up to work, and if their children couldn't go to a place of education, they could not run their businesses. So we can now move on from that to how did, given that that's the initial response to COVID, we can categorize those responses into those who resisted change. There are certain categories who wanted to drive change, others just wanted to wait for direction, and a third or fourth group just wanted to maintain the status quo. Let's now go through to what the state of education and technology was pre-COVID. Pre-COVID, there was a vast range, or there has always been a vast range, of uses of technology in education. And that vast range, in general, the category that was most used is the use of technology as a resource in order to get teaching done. So in general, within the classroom, you will find whiteboards, interactive whiteboards, overhead projectors, a range of screens, and also computer suites across the schools or the educational institution where the learners can do their work digitally. There are, however, two other categories of uses of educational technology that were possible. One was using using technology as a learning tool. In effect, by using technology, the learners are able to better learn. And another one is using technology as an environment for learning. Interestingly enough, after the first wave started, in fact, probably after the first wave of COVID was over and the education institutions returned for a short period of time, then directions came into schools to start using technology as an environment. And in effect, until schools were directed to teach using online methods, which is in effect with technology, do your teaching remotely. That's a great example of the use of technology as an environment for learning. But it required a pandemic for technology that was already in existence to be used in that particular way. Now, very interestingly enough, now that the learners have gone back to school, it appears that a lot of schools are returning to type and dropping the educational benefits that have been accrued. Let's now look at what should be happening in education. There are different ways of looking at the purpose of education, and one of the few ways I'll look at today is education for innovation. And what I'm looking at here is the STEM aspects of education. And what's important here is an understanding of how things work is important, partly on the basis that we can only improve things that we know about. Now, this takes me back to one of the first questions that I asked, which is technology making individuals less intelligent? Now, in general, what we tend to sort of say is, I don't need to know how to do that because my computer does it for me. However, the act of generating improvements is innovation. Now, if we don't know how something works in the first place, we can't innovate on it. And while implementing innovation is how I would describe leadership. So in effect, if we don't know how something works, we stifle innovation, and we in turn stifle leadership. What we teach and how we teach it should emphasize those three concepts. Now, that's the STEM aspect of things. If we now look at humanities aspect of things, we tend to look at STEM as the sciences, technology, etc. However, how technology is used is also critical to the world around us. And the humanities is what will drive the discussion about how inventions and innovation is put to use. But this requires stakeholders to truly understand and appreciate the technology and its impact, either the designed impact or the unintended impact. Let's take the example of driving a vehicle, a motor vehicle in this case, because some vehicles are now electric. Do you need to know how an internal combustion engine works in order to drive a vehicle? Most people will answer no. However, in order for to have a sustainable policy around the motor vehicle, some knowledge of how it works is important. Moving on, let's look at education as a sector of the economy. Now, this is now trying to look at the sustainability of education in general. What governments and suppliers to the educational sector are interested in are what it's going to cost to them in terms of government. So they look at education as a pit into which they sink money. On the other hand, the suppliers to education look at it as how they can earn money. Now, these two interests don't align themselves with the quality of the service that's produced in the end. So, in my view, one of the things I'll be looking at is there should be an emphasis on the use of experts in their fields to teach at all levels of education. And when education is viewed as communication and collaboration, it's easier to identify the skills to develop in teachers, learners, and other stakeholders. Now, if we look at pre-COVID or in general, we tend to look at education as a teacher teaching somebody how to do something, or a teacher teaching another teacher, so there's mentoring or coaching involved. One of the things COVID has shown us is that there's a lot of learner-to-learner interaction and collaboration, which results in positive outcomes. Now, even surprisingly enough, there's also been learner-to-teacher interaction, where the teachers learn better about their area of expertise through the learner's experiences. Now, those things are areas where we can develop further to improve the way in which education is delivered and facilitated going forward.